Hi everyone, Clint Edmondson with Microsoft. In this screencast, we're going to talk about organizing features into use case models. I want to once again reintroduce our client for this application, Tailspin Toys. It's a small brick and mortar hobby shop that sells model airplanes. And what they're looking for is an online storefront to supplement in-store sales. But first, a couple of guidelines. When doing use case modeling, it's always a good idea to break up user goals and tasks into separate digestible diagrams. Use those diagrams as a structural guide for actually writing the requirements as use case documents. I also want to say a few quick words about actors before we begin our modeling session. First, actors are always external participants to the solution. Actors always interact directly with the system. Actors represent roles. And finally, use cases are always initiated by an actor. All right, let's switch over to Visual Studio and do some use case modeling. First thing I'm going to do is open up my brainstorming workshop from the last screencast and refamiliarize myself with the actors and some of the activities that we identified during our workshop. You can see here we've got customer, store manager, and time, and at each one of those we've got a nice set of functionality. Let's start with customer and dive in and start creating a use case diagram and explore some of those function points. So let's create a new use case diagram. We're going to call it customer. And notice I've got my tool palette we saw in the last screencast with basic elements used for drawing use cases. What I want to do though is go over to this other tab, UML Model Explorer, and notice that from our brainstorming workshop we've already got some of the models elements created here for us. So rather than create a brand new customer to a new diagram, I'm going to pull an existing element from the model in here. And that will be our basic customer. We'll switch back to our toolbox. And let's say we're going to cover some of the core things we identified in our brainstorming workshop. So shop for toys, check order status, cancel an order, refund an order, and view order history. So let's go ahead and create those. So I'm going to double click on the use case model, use case tool palette so that we can create multiple elements on our diagram, and let's put 5 of those in here. Hit escape, and let's start with the first one, shop for toys. Check order status, cancel order, refund order that I've already received, and the last one would be view order history. There we go. Just kind of lay those out nicely. Now what I want to do is create an association with this actor for all of those, so we're going to create set of associations. I'm going to do the same thing. Let me double click here so I can draw multiple associations. Alright, that covers our basic set of functionality. Now, one of the things I noticed when reading these sets of features that we've identified during the brainstorming session was a thing here in quotes. See that registered customers only? What that's telling us is there's a special subset of our customers who get to do some extra functionality. Now in use case diagram terminology, that implies a generalization association between an actor and another actor. So what we want to do, since in our UML model we only have customer, store manager, and time, that requirement has kind of prompted us to create a specialized version of our customer that we'll call registered customer. And because they can do everything that a basic customer can do, we're going to use a generalization link and we're going to connect those two. So again, this says that this registered customer can do everything that the basic customer can do. Now in addition, they're going to want to do some special stuff that we identified in the brainstorming session. And that includes receiving special coupons and offers, rating toys, and writing reviews of toys. We talked that over with our client and they said, you know what, I want to make sure that people who rate and review toys are registered so that their names are associated with that review or with that rating and they're shown on screen. So let's start with those two. So those are fairly straightforward. So rate a toy. And the second one be write a toy review. There we go. Create some basic associations for those. There we go. Now, special thing I noticed. They receive special offers and coupons, receive shipping notifications. Now those are fairly passive. They're not active verbs, which means the actor won't necessarily be initiating those. What that tells me during analysis is that these will probably be steps within another use case somewhere else. So for the time being, we're going to leave those there because we want to capture those, but at this point they will not be use cases because they aren't triggered by the actor doing something specific. I think we've got a fairly good representation here. Talking over with the client, one thing that's come to mind is that that shop for toys use case has quite a few sub-steps in there. There's browsing, there's searching, viewing lists, there's reading reviews, adding toys to a shopping cart, adding toys to wish lists, viewing shopping cart content. So a ton of functionality here. And based on my experience, that's probably going to amount to a very, very large use case. I like to use roughly a rule of 12. If there's more than 12 analysis steps or analysis flows in a use case, it should be broken up into sub-use cases. So in this case, shop for toys is probably a little too big. So what we may want to do is break it up in a little bit more detail, just to make our requirements and our execution a little easier. So let's go ahead and change this from shop for toys to browse for toys. And I think this makes a lot of sense because in talking to our client, it turns out that not every person who visits the site actually buys a toy. A lot of people come there and just look at the reviews, they look at the prices. So browsing in and of itself is still a fairly meaningful interaction that the customer can have with our site. Now on top of browsing, they may want to view toy details, which again is some fairly significant functionality in and of itself. They may want to add toy to shopping cart. They may want to add toy to their wish list. Or they may want to check out. We could continue with all the other functions and features as well, but I think this gives you enough of an idea to get a feel for what I'm trying to do here by breaking this up. Now, what makes this interesting, and let's give ourselves a little bit more room here. What makes this interesting is that there's a special relationship between this browse for toys use case and these others, and that is that this browse for toys use case kind of sits at the top level and these others are included by it. Specifically, the view toy details. When you're browsing, you're searching categories, you're looking at bestsellers. At some point you want to view the details for a particular item. And we may have enough functionality to warrant its own use case in that sense. So at that point, while you're viewing for toy details, that's when you would probably most likely add it to a shopping cart. So again, we want to do an includes relationship here. It says this activity will include that. Clean up our diagram. I may, instead of adding to a shopping cart, I may want to add it to a wish list. So there's yet another includes relationship. And at any point in time during this process, I'll want to check out, or potentially want to check out. So we're going to include that as well. Notice I dragged that there. So there we go. So again, you don't have to go to this level of detail, but I suspect based on the features we brainstormed that this use case, browse for toys or shop for toys, the original use case might get kind of large. So we're going to go ahead and break that down. It's also possible that this might make more sense put into its own diagram. At that point, I might create a brand new diagram and call it customer browsing, and specifically just show the customer and these 5 or 6 use cases that are involved in that. So it just depends on how large your model becomes, how much you need to break it down. But I think for purposes of this screencast, I think we've got plenty here. So grab my elements and clean this up. Notice I spent a lot of time tweaking the layout. That is because I believe that one of the most important reasons to use these diagrams is to communicate your designs and your ideas. And if they're not readable by someone, they don't lay out and flow nicely and evenly, then they're not going to be of much use. They're going to be of limited value communicating what you're trying to discuss. So there we go. That looks pretty clean. All right, so that covers the customer. Let's do one more just to make sure we've kind of covered this. So let's go ahead and add another use case model. And this one will be for the store manager. Once again, I'll flip over to my model, and because I know the store manager is already in our overall model for the system, I'll drag it in there. Okay, so let's flip back over to our brainstorming diagram and take a look at what the store manager's activities are. We've got roughly 5 things here: process open orders, view sales, send special offers, manage accounts, and manage inventory. So let's go ahead and create those in this diagram. Again, I'll flip over to my toolbox, I'll double click on use case, and I'll drop 5 of those on here. Hit escape. And let's see, so the first one was process open orders, view sales reports, manage inventory, manage customer accounts, send out special offers. Now notice, these are not the same order that I read them to you from the brainstorm diagram. What I've done is actually done a little bit of prioritization here into what I think might be the order of importance. So by far, processing open orders is going to be the primary, most prevalent use case that the actor might do. View sales reports, probably second. Managing inventory, if sales start to look pretty low, they're going to have to go in and manage their inventory. Managing customer accounts, this is customers wanting to delete their accounts or reset their passwords, and then sending out special offers, which might happen occasionally. And now this is my guess as an analyst or as an architect. I would absolutely run this by and discuss this with the client and see if that makes sense. In fact, there'll most likely during the process be a more formal prioritization, but I can kind of gauge this based on what I already know about the domain we're looking at and some of the conversations I've had with the customers. So I think this makes for a nice layout. So let's go ahead and add the associations in here. And nice and simple. Dependencies. So one thing I noticed over in the brainstorming session during process open orders, there was a specific activity called cancel and refund an order. And to me, that kind of sounded like something that might not happen with every open order. It's kind of a special case, so I thought it might be good to show that in this diagram using a different kind of relationship. So let's go ahead and add that out here, and we'll call that cancel an order. And what that is an extended relationship, which means there's a special condition which will trigger and cause this other use case to be invoked. It's not going to be typically done every time, but it's going to be done occasionally on an infrequent basis. So I'm going to go ahead and add a note that talks about that. So since this is an infrequent scenario that has completely different workflow, it will be developed a separate use case. Slap that on here. We'll add a comment link to link these two together. And so that's perfectly acceptable to do in use case diagrams. Remember, the whole point of this is to do an analysis and create an artifact from your analysis. Oops, I notice I've got a bad relationship. Let's go ahead and delete that one and put the association back in there, where it should be. So the idea is this is an analysis tool. It's meant to help you explore the requirements, help you prioritize them, put them and package them and structure them and scope them. So by all means, use it as you need to. It's a communication tool. It's not meant to be a document that you leave behind. It's meant to be the artifact for the actual thinking process that you go through when developing an application or a solution. So I think with that, we'll switch back to the slide deck and wrap this up. Okay, some tips for better use case modeling. First, think of actors as roles, not necessarily job titles. Most job titles these days span multiple roles, and it's better to focus your actors in one specific set of functionality. Always use business domain terminology when writing these use cases and tasks. Focus on the actor's goals, not the implementation details. Remember, we're doing analysis here. We're not trying to solve the problem yet. We're really scoping out what the solution needs to encompass. Always use strong active verbs in the names of both your use cases as well as the tasks. Focus on only one feature area in a single diagram. You noticed I did customer. You can even go even further and break customer into customer shopping, customer account management, so on and so forth. Stack use cases and diagrams to show their relative order. We talked about that a little bit in the store manager use case, where I had a rough idea of what the order of operation, but the idea is just really to prioritize those to give us a good glance at this use case and really get a good feel for understanding it. Finally, you can use color and notes to document important details. I used a note specifically to show that this particular scenario extended off of one of the earlier scenarios. I could also go and use color. Maybe at some point when we start talking about our implementation plan, we build our iteration plan together and we color code the use cases in the order that they're going to be implemented. So iteration 1 might be blue, iteration 2 might be green. One of the toughest things about learning UML is finding good examples, so I've got some great references here for you. Use case modeling, use cases, patterns, and blueprints, and UML2 and the unified process. Now all three of these offer excellent examples and a diverse set of examples of good use case models for you to draw upon. And finally, some resources for you. All the models you've seen were built using Visual Studio 2010 Ultimate. You can find a link to download that here. I've also got a link to the architect team's blog, as well as a link to my blog if you're interested in getting the materials, both the slide deck and the solution project with my diagrams in it. Feel free to visit me at www.notsotrivial.net. Thanks for tuning in.